What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you an update of sorts for No Rest for the Wicked. A sort of isometric Souls-like title that released into early access in April of last year, so coming up on a year in early access, but it has nonetheless been pretty quiet in that time frame. So we finally got some news of that last week from the time of this video, like literally about 7 days ago, which unfortunately was an update that released while I was extremely busy, so it took me a little while to get around to covering this, but I'm a big fan of the game and what I've seen of it, so I wanted to naturally cover it. Now, the sort of big news here is that the game is getting a big update, in fact, something like 11,000 changes on April 30th. And what's more, we also got some reasoning behind why the sort of silence, and none of it is too surprising, and we'll get to that in a moment. But that silence, or, mostly silence, has been the case since like 7 or 8 months ago when the Crucible dropped. And both before and after the Crucible dropped, my opinion had largely been the same, in that No Rest for the Wicked I think is likely going to be a fantastic game when it's finished, but was very rough around the edges at the time. With all of that said, though, let's actually dive into this. So first and foremost, why the long silence? Well, basically Moon Studios was being published by Private Division, which was pretty unceremoniously shut down in what was a shock to pretty much everybody it was publishing at the time, which included Moon Studios, the studio behind No Rest for the Wicked. And as a result of that, they had, of course, a bunch of things to deal with behind the scenes, and the long and short of it is simply that they are, in fact, a fully independent studio now. And while all of that was ongoing, they've been working on this massive update to release called The Breach. As I've already mentioned, The Breach is going to be something like 11,000 changes and make some pretty sweeping changes to the game, as it were, including new zones, new weapon types, a new pestilence mechanic, expanding the current already present zones, reworked loot, items, you name it. But to go over that stuff a little more individually, the story of the game will actually be kicking off and continuing, which is what is going to be prompting us to head out to these new zones, of course, but we're going to see some of that unfold, including some of the political drama therein. But all told, just the new zones will apparently be expanding the current sort of play area by like double, and that I don't think includes what they are planning on expanding the current zones with. So in addition to these new zones, such as the meadows or this sort of infested swamp area with their own new enemies and quests and stuff, of course, they are also adding and changing up the current zones and just, offering more exploration up in those as well. Now, these new zones will apparently incorporate a new town as well, which is obviously going to have things like its own vendors and whatnot. And while they didn't specifically specify it, I am a little bit curious to see if that town will be like customizable the way the main one is, or not so much customizable, but like upgradable perhaps would be a better word, which is interesting in any event, I think. But while you're exploring all of this new content, you're likely going to come across the game's new weapon types and the revamped versions of what is already here. So straight away, we get a new gauntlet and wand weapon, which do pretty much what you'd expect. Gauntlets allow you to have a more sort of unarmed physical play style, and then wands will shoot various types of magic with their own combos and stuff. But what really had me really interested was actually the reworks they've done to the loot system. So for instance, they've mentioned that they've reworked loot drops straight away, in the sense that you'll be able to add enchantments to items via embers. So items that don't already have their full list of possible enchantments, you can use an ember to, of course, randomize one, and then you can also replace current ones with these. And seeing as embers are what your character uses to respec, they imagine that will be a pretty highly sought after item. Now, that's not all, however. Some items will be able to be masterworked, though they didn't explain too much of what that meant in this, but gems as well will now fully explain what they add to individual items they are socketed in. And then perhaps most excitingly, they took a look at sort of weapon types that people weren't really using so much, like the shield, for instance. So now the shield uses its own like posture system that is unique to shields, in order to give people a bigger incentive to actually use them. But speaking of slight combat changes, another thing was a pretty substantial rework to the way food and healing in combat works. So previously you basically had food items you could use, but when you used them it initiated a cooldown. Well, instead of that cooldown, they are allowing you to basically eat food instantly, with the sort of caveat that you can only do that so many times per combat, which makes sense. That's basically more of a Dark Souls approach, in the sense that, you only had so many flasks typically. And then the amount you're allowed to use in combat, that kind of thing, will be upgraded through various progression systems to make it even more useful. But in theory, it should be easier to heal mid-combat now. which may very well be something you'll be making good use of via the game's new pestilence mechanic. Both the new and the old zones will be subject to pestilence. So the story of the game is that a pestilence has come and sort of taken over the island, as it were, and now we're actually going to see that happening in real time. Places will be infected by pestilence, which will offer up new and more enemies, and altogether, they drop various little items that you can use to then increase the challenge of the area, and doing that will net you more rewards, but killing so many pestilence creatures will then summon the boss of that area, and then if you can kill that boss, it removes the pestilence from the zone, which is like the main job of our sort of holy warrior character, the Serum, which is a big part of the plot. And they mentioned wanting this mechanic to make through running through old zones for things like quests, etc., to allow for some replayability there and not just, be super boring because you're running through the same stuff every time, while also giving you the potential for loot and things. Now, outside of combat and zones, in town, I would say one of the more contentious things I saw people mention about No Rest for the Wicked is that some of the upgrades you could make to the town sort of initiated timers you had to wait for. Well, it looks like in response to some of that feedback, what they're doing is instituting a way to commit sort of more resources basically to individual projects that will then reduce the time required that you have to wait for those upgrades to take place. But they did mention that they are still absolutely listening to feedback on that and they're open to suggestions. So I get the feeling we probably haven't seen the sort of final iteration of that system just yet. So that's worth knowing. And then last but not least, for those people who really want a challenge, you can, once this update drops, making use of hardcore characters, which are pretty much what they sound like. Hardcore characters can then, if they die, they are not permanently gone, but they lose their hardcore status. Now, right before we wrap this video up, probably the part of this people aren't going to love so much is because these changes are so extensive, they're pretty much going to require you to start fresh. But it did make it sound like they plan on preserving a sort of beta branch over on the Steam build so that if you have like characters and stuff up to this point that you'll be able to use them and, finish up whatever you were doing. But by and large, it sounds like this is a bit of a reset, which I suppose we will see how people feel about. Overall, I would say this seems to be a pretty sweeping update that moves the game in the right direction, the direction people have been asking for, which is, of course, things like, actual content and story updates, additions to the campaign overall. And while I will certainly have to actually see how this plays for myself when it drops, and do expect me to cover that, but again, to me, it looks like this game might finally be moving in the right direction, and I'm excited to see where it goes from here. And hopefully, now that all that stuff with Private Division has been worked out, we might actually see some more regular updates. But for the sake of this video, I think that's pretty much going to do it. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it informative. If you did, by all means, like, comment, subscribe, all that YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.